The last time humans were on the moon was December 14th, 1972. A little bit under 50 years ago. To put that into perspective, 50 years before 1972, World War I had just ended. World War II was 17 years away, and only 6% of people owned a car. Or should I say an automobile, because that's how far back we're talking. In the past 50 years, humanity has imprisoned herself to low Earth orbit. We're going to talk about why. Welcome back. This is the Our Engineered World podcast, bridging the gap between history and engineering. If you like this episode and you want to hear more like it, go ahead and subscribe or follow. New episodes come out every Tuesday. If you could compare the space race during the Cold War to a boxing match, America during the entire first round was pinned in the corner. The Soviets sent punch after punch, first man in space, first woman in space, even the first dog in space. Space Buds was a Soviet classic. America fell short at every milestone, ended up leaving the first round with not only a broken nose, but a deflated ego. Obviously, they had to change gears. In one moment at Rice University, John F. Kennedy did just that. He changed the rules of the entire game.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
This moment was akin to two children racing from the school door to a tree. When the first child makes it to the tree, he decides to climb it. When the second child makes it to the tree, he says, "Let's race to the store across the street." Obviously, it's cheating, but the store across the street just sounds so much cooler. The Russians were already too far up the tree of earthly orbit to compete in a moon race, so they didn't. But John F. Kennedy wasn't just satisfied with making it to the moon before the Russians. He set a deadline. The deadline proved to spur American innovation, but at the cost of serious infrastructure to support any further missions. NASA was run by a Nazi. Officially, of course not. There was never a Nazi at the head of NASA. That, of course, would be a PR nightmare. Although the ex-NASA rocket scientist Von Braun never officially led NASA, he unofficially was the backbone of the America's space program. Von Braun was an eccentrist. He cared little about the use of his rockets, as long as he could work towards his futurist ideas. Whether it be a man or a nuclear warhead strapped to the top, Von was at the bleeding edge of rocket technology. He published science fiction books and articles illustrating his vision of the colonization of space. His vision of the space race was to build strong infrastructure, space stations that would hold dozens of scientists and engineers. Space shuttles would cheaply move cargo to and from Earth. These stations would act as checkpoints and gateways to the outer solar system. Colonization efforts on both the Moon and Mars would soon follow. But in his current role, being transferred into the American Army in 1945, he wasn't at the top of the totem pole. He had orders to follow. As Kennedy said, we only have until the end of the decade. How, then, would we be able to build all of this infrastructure? Well, the obvious answer is we couldn't. Unlike Wendy's, we cut corners, and a lot of them. Remember, the Soviets were still up the tree of earthly orbit, making plans for space stations and other orbital infrastructure. If we were to miss the deadline we set for ourselves, we would have lost in the minds of the people. How, then, can we accomplish this lofty goal? We don't have the time for Von Braun's infrastructure. Infrastructure that would be critical for refueling, communication relays, and astronaut checkpoints. That's where John Cornelius Houbolt comes into play. Now, don't get me wrong, John Houbolt was an intelligent guy in his own right. He came up with the best way to accomplish the goal laid out by the president. His method for reaching the moon? LOR, Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, which was what ended up getting Neil Armstrong to the moon. Having a lander separate from an orbital vehicle meant fuel could be conserved and allowed for a mission that needed no prior infrastructure. The whole mission was essentially packed onto the Saturn V.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
3 years after Armstrong said those famous words, the Apollo program was shut down. That's the first lesson people listening to this story can learn. Never accomplish your end goal without doing everything you wanted to do first. Money just has a way of evaporating. Scientifically, the mission was an amazing success. As an investment to develop humanity's space travel potential, it really did nothing. NASA engineers expected a resurgence of funds triggered by the moon landing. This marked the end of the space race era and the beginning of a new space shuttle age. Saying that, I think it's time for a break. To recap, we are now in 1971. The Apollo program has shut down and NASA's budget is now less than half of what it was at its height in the 60s. In 1969, months before Armstrong set foot on the moon, President Nixon called in a meeting. The purpose? A post-Apollo plan. Nixon rounded up head scientists and engineers and created a space task force. Their task? Determining what NASA would do post-Apollo. The group unilaterally decided that NASA should go back to adhering to von Braun's original plan. Shuttles, space stations, moon base, and even Mars, the whole shebang. Nixon, being focused only on the small picture of his presidency, wanted to narrow down the focus to something that was achievable with NASA's now shoestring budget. The only thing that we could do on its own was space shuttles. Thus, the space shuttle era began. The space shuttle's development goes way back before this decision, though. Remember, it was part of von Braun's original plan, after all. The designs, again, originate, unfortunately, with Nazis. They created concepts of a space plane, one that could go up into orbit and then drop bombs onto New York. After the war, the Navy took this concept and ran with it, creating the X-15 rocket plane. It got into orbit and still holds the record for the fastest manned spacecraft at 7,274 kilometers per hour, or for the Americans, who are probably the bulk of my listenership anyways, 4,520 miles per hour. This design for a reusable space vehicle was kept and developed upon until the very first space shuttle as we know it today rolled out of production in 1977. Her name? Enterprise. She was definitely not as advanced as originally intended due to budgetary issues. Still, it was a space shuttle, with both solid boosters and the shuttle itself being fully reusable, with a healthy amount of refurbishment. The only problem was the external fuel tank. The huge white and then later an unpainted orange tank was not reusable. The plan was to use this unpolished design to tell the Gen 2 spaceplane. We used it until 2011. The space shuttle became a costly, lackluster endeavor that gave NASA a scar of wasting taxpayer money. Combine this with the tragic Columbia crash where 7 astronauts died on re-entry. Then, only 5 years later, mind you, the Challenger explosions where 6 astronauts and a civilian teacher died, and thus their budget stagnated at 0.5%. NASA was struggling to get confidence back into the program, and thus they ended up shifting towards a more scientific, less human approach until the 90s during the construction of the International Space Station, or ISS. The station, first completed in 1998, continued to evolve and still serves as the epicenter of human space research. It is partially part of Braun's original plan, a home base in space. The only problem is the ISS is no checkpoint. It's a bare-bones facility not built to refuel missions. It's also past its expiration date. The ISS was planned to burn in Earth's atmosphere sometime in 2020. As you probably know, it's still up there. NASA now plans to keep the ISS in space. Apparently, they have learned something about fully completing mission objective. Hopefully, it will continue to expand as more commercial entities gain access. In 2011, the last space shuttle was launched, and until last week, the last astronaut left American soil. And I repeat, on a 30-year-old design. Since then, NASA has been paying the Russians about $86 million a seat on their just as ancient Soyuz rocket. This is obviously not ideal. For one, we're overpaying for a launch. SpaceX's Dragon capsule costs just $55 million a seat, and the price is dropping rapidly. Secondly, political tension between Russia and the United States, which obviously exists, could end a spaceflight any day. How then was NASA able to come this far to a point of having the most advanced rocket technology in the United States without getting an increase in budget? Easy. They outsourced it. Commercial companies are not held back by as many regulations as NASA and other government entities are. They're also forced to innovate at a higher rate to compete with other companies. NASA decided to give grants to promising companies, and in return, these companies would continue to innovate and develop. At that point, NASA could turn around and pay them as contractors to execute missions. This idea seems to have worked since several key players, including Boeing and SpaceX, have created magnitudes more advanced, reliable, and cost-effective launch systems than their government counterparts. SpaceX even mastered self-landing of reusable rockets, a technology that drastically reduced cost, allowing for larger payloads at the same rate. It also looks badass. The future of space technology never looked brighter since Apollo. On May 30th, 2020, the first astronaut since 2011 left American soil on their journey to space. And there's an interesting interview that happened in 2004 with SpaceX's founder, Elon Musk.
Well, I think fundamentally the way we help NASA is by lowering the cost of access to space, allowing us to do more interesting things for a given budget. In fact, I think what we're doing is critical to the future of NASA. At the current prices that NASA pays for space transportation, I don't think we'll be able to achieve anything interesting in space.
He has plans to colonize Mars and is even developing a rocket to do so. Along with that, NASA's current human spaceflight program, Artemis, which plans to build a space station orbiting the moon, serving as a refueling point for travel beyond. Von Braun's dream of a colonized space is finally coming into fruition. Von Braun's dream of a colonized space is finally coming into fruition. Only 75 years after he began working for the United States. Well, that's our show today. If you liked it, make sure to follow and subscribe and share it with your friends. If you have any critiques, comments, or questions, let me know. And if I get some good ones, I'll read them at the end of the next episode. Email me at engineeredworldpodcast@gmail.com or on Instagram. And all of the sources will be in the description of the YouTube video. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next time about Our Engineered World.